The story begins not in peace, but in fire. Imagine the 9th century landscape of England, villages scattered across river valleys, wooden halls glowing with hearth smoke, churches ringing bells to mark the hours of prayer. Yet into this fragile rhythm thundered the prows of dragon-prowed ships, their sails blotting the horizon, their oars slicing the waters with unrelenting force. To the farmers and monks of Anglo-Saxon England, these were not mere raiders but storm spirits in human form, the Vikings, who descended with iron in their hands and fire in their breath. Monasteries burned, towns collapsed, whole kingdoms vanished in the onrush of northern fury. The island seemed cursed to fall, one kingdom after another reduced to embers. And in that chaos, we glimpse a scene of almost unbearable contrast, a king not seated on a golden throne, but crouched in a smoky hut on a marsh island called Athelney. He is disguised, ragged, weakened by defeat. According to later legend, when asked by a peasant woman to watch her loaves in the fire, he let them burn while lost in thought about the survival of his people. This moment, half tragedy, half parable, captures the tension of a nation teetering between annihilation and survival. The man in the hut was Alfred, son of Wessex, soon to be called the Great. In him lay the last fragile thread of Anglo-Saxon independence, a land at the edge of oblivion. To understand the weight upon Alfred's shoulders, one must see the broader canvas of 9th century Europe. England was not a single nation, but a patchwork of kingdoms, Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia to the east, and Wessex in the south. Each had its own king, its own pride, and often its own rivalries with the others. This heptarchy of Anglo-Saxon realms had long been both a strength and a weakness, a mosaic of cultures and customs, yet divided when unity was most needed. Against them stood the great pagan host. From their homelands in Denmark and Norway, the Vikings had mastered the sea, treating it not as a barrier, but as a highway. They struck without warning, raiding monasteries like Lindisfarne in 793, spreading terror that echoed across Europe. What began as plunder soon became conquest. By 865, a coalition of warriors known to chroniclers as the Great Heathen Army landed on English shores, not for treasure alone, but to seize land and rule. One by one, the old kingdoms collapsed. Northumbria fell, its kings slain. East Anglia was erased, its ruler martyred. Mercia, once mighty, was humbled. It seemed inevitable that Wessex too would fall into shadow. The unexpected king. Into this crucible stepped Alfred. Born in 849, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, Alfred was never expected to rule. His older brothers carried the burden of kingship, while he was sent abroad as a child, even traveling to Rome, where he received the blessing of the Pope. Unlike many princes of his age, Alfred was not defined only by sword and shield. He was drawn to books, to learning, to the moral vision of Christianity. Yet fate has a way of calling the least expected. One by one, his brothers died in war, until Alfred, still young, found the crown thrust upon his head in 871, the very year the Viking tide surged at its fiercest. The chronicles describe those early years of his reign as unrelenting trial. The men of Wessex fought battle after battle. Some won, many lost. Villages emptied, refugees streamed south, and the weight of defeat pressed upon the land. Then, in the dark winter of 878, came catastrophe. The Viking warlord Guthrum launched a surprise assault on Chippenham, Alfred's stronghold. In the dead of night, the defenses collapsed. Alfred barely escaped with his life. The kingdom itself seemed extinguished. The hero at the lowest point. Here the narrative tightens to its most dramatic chord. A king without a throne, without an army, without hope, retreats to the swamps of Somerset. In the stillness of the marshes, with only a handful of followers, Alfred faced the abyss. Was England to vanish into the sea of Norse conquest? Would the language, the laws, the faith of the Anglo-Saxons be swallowed forever? Legend paints him in those weeks as a man both broken and remade. The burned loaves of bread are more than a domestic mishap. They are an image of a king, so consumed with the survival of his people that the ordinary world fell away. For in the silence of that exile, Alfred conceived not only how to strike back, but how to rebuild, how to give his people a future. From marshland ashes, he would forge the first vision of a united England, the bridge into the epic. When Alfred re-emerged from Athelney, he did so not as a fugitive, but as a leader transfigured. He rallied the fyrd, the peasant soldiers of Wessex, and marched to meet Guthrum at Edington. There, in one of the most decisive battles of English history, he broke the Viking host, forcing their leader into baptism and peace. From that moment, Alfred's story ceased to be that of a beleaguered warlord. It became the narrative of a founder, a lawgiver, a scholar, a defender of faith and nation. And so the tale unfolds, of a man who turned disaster into destiny, who built fortresses across the land, who preserved learning when darkness threatened to erase it, who stitched together a divided people into the seed of a kingdom. He was not merely a survivor, but a creator. That is why history remembers him as the Great, the first English king to bear that title, and the first true hero in the long, turbulent history of England. This is the saga of Alfred, the king who rose from the ashes of defeat to become the architect of a nation. Yet to grasp the magnitude of Alfred's triumph, one must first look back at the world he inherited, a land not yet united, but divided into the warring realms of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. To understand the rise of Alfred, one must first walk through the fractured map of 9th century England. It was not yet a nation, but a quilt of kingdoms, each stitched together by kinship, custom, and ambition. This patchwork of realms, remembered as the Heptarchy, formed the stage upon which the fate of England would be decided. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, and Sussex, 7 names that echoed with pride, rivalry, and fragile power. Wessex, the last bulwark, in the far south, shielded by rolling downs and winding rivers, lay Wessex. Its kings traced their lineage back to Cerdic, a semi-legendary founder said to have arrived from across the sea. Wessex was not the largest of the kingdoms, nor the richest, but it possessed something rarer: resilience. Its soil was fertile, its people hardy, and its rulers, though often contested, proved capable of rallying their subjects in times of peril. Yet even here, unity was fragile. Noble families quarreled, and succession often brought bloodshed. Still, by the 9th century, Wessex had grown into the strongest hope for survival against the northern storm. Mercia, the once mighty heartland. To the Midlands stretched Mercia, a land of rivers and fertile plains, long the dominant power of Anglo-Saxon England. In the 8th century, under kings like Offa, Mercia towered over its neighbors. Offa's Dyke, the massive earthwork running along the Welsh border, symbolized both strength and ambition. For generations, Mercia exacted tribute from Kent, Sussex, and even challenged Wessex. But by Alfred's time, Mercia was faltering. Dynastic struggles drained its vigor, and the Viking hammer fell hardest on its weakened frame. Once the beating heart of England, Mercia now gasped for survival, forced into uneasy alliance with its southern neighbor, Wessex. Northumbria, a kingdom of glory and ruin. Far to the north, between the rivers Humber and Forth, rose Northumbria. Once a beacon of learning and faith, it had given the world Bede the historian and the monasteries like Jarrow and Lindisfarne. Its scholars illuminated manuscripts that carried the light of knowledge across Europe. Yet its brilliance hid fatal fractures. Rival dynasties in Bernicia and Deira feuded endlessly, weakening the kingdom. By the late 9th century, Northumbria was ripe for conquest. When the Viking great army struck, it toppled the kingdom with shocking ease, scattering its kings and dimming its ancient glory. East Anglia, the martyr's land. On the eastern plains, East Anglia was smaller in size but rich in spirit. Its king, Edmund, would become a martyr, slain by the Vikings in 869 after refusing to renounce his Christian faith. His death became a legend, casting East Anglia as a land of sacrifice. Yet in political and military strength, the kingdom was fragile. Its armies could not withstand the organized ferocity of the Danes. With Edmund's death, East Anglia ceased to exist as an independent power, its lands absorbed into the Danelaw. Kent, the cradle of Christianity. Kent, nestled in the southeast, was among the earliest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, famed for its conversion to Christianity under King Ethelbert in the days of Augustine's mission. Its proximity to the continent made it a gateway for trade and culture. But by Alfred's day, Kent's independence was long gone, overshadowed first by Mercia, then drawn into the orbit of Wessex. Though diminished, its strategic position near the Channel meant it remained a prize coveted by conquerors. Essex and Sussex, shadows on the margins. The Eastern Kingdom of Essex and the Southern Kingdom of Sussex, once proud names, had by the 9th century become little more than shadows. Bound by stronger neighbors, their kings often acted as subordinates to Mercia or Wessex. Yet their lands, though politically diminished, were not without importance. Essex controlled access to London, a jewel on the Thames, while Sussex commanded the southern coastlines vulnerable to Viking attack. In their weakness lay both peril and potential for those who could wield them. A patchwork destined for conflict, this was the landscape Alfred inherited, a land of proud histories but fractured power. Each kingdom bore strengths, Mercia's heartland, Northumbria's culture, Wessex's resilience, but each carried weaknesses, division, rivalry, and vulnerability. The Heptarchy was less a family than a chorus of competing voices, rarely singing in harmony. And into this divided world came the storm. The Vikings cared nothing for the rivalries of Anglo-Saxon kings. They saw only plunder, land, and dominion. One by one these kingdoms fell, their weaknesses exploited, their crowns shattered. Northumbria collapsed, East Anglia erased, Mercia humbled. Only Wessex, battered but unbroken, remained standing. It was upon this fragile stage, with ruin pressing in from every side, that Alfred would emerge, not merely as a king of Wessex, but as the last defender of the Anglo-Saxon world, and the unlikely architect of a united England. Yet even as Alfred fought to hold the line with sword and shield, the deeper strength of his people lay elsewhere, in the faith that bound their souls, and the culture that preserved their memory. Faith and culture. Amid the clash of swords and the smoke of burning towns, there pulsed another force, quieter yet no less powerful, the spirit of faith and learning. The Anglo-Saxon world was not held together by kings alone, but by the church, the monasteries, and the written word. In a time when kingdoms rose and fell with dizzying speed, the church gave the people something older, steadier, and eternal. The church as anchor. Across the landscape of England stood the towers and crosses of stone churches, small yet steadfast, binding the rhythms of daily life to the eternal rhythm of heaven. Monks rang bells that carried across valleys, calling the faithful to prayer, even as Viking sails appeared on the horizon. Bishops counseled kings, urging them to see their power as granted by God, and reminding them that victory in battle meant nothing without victory of the soul. The church was also a network of influence that stretched beyond England. Ties to Rome reinforced the legitimacy of rulers and bound the Anglo-Saxon people into the greater Christian world. Alfred himself, as a boy, had walked through the streets of Rome and bowed before the Pope, a reminder that Wessex was not an isolated realm, but part of a vast Christendom stretching across the continent. The monasteries, beacons of light. If the church was the anchor of faith, the monasteries were the lamps of culture. Scattered from Lindisfarne to Canterbury, these communities preserved the fragile flame of knowledge. Within their cloisters, monks bent over parchment, copying sacred texts by flickering candlelight, their quills scratching the silence. To them, writing was both devotion and defiance, a way to preserve God's word in human memory against the storms of time. Yet these very beacons made them targets. The Viking raiders, fierce and pragmatic, saw monasteries as treasure troves. Gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, even cattle and slaves, all could be taken. Lindisfarne in 793 became the first great warning. Monks slaughtered, relics scattered, the holy place consumed by fire. The terror spread, yet even in ruins the monks endured, rebuilding, writing, and remembering. Their resilience mirrored the endurance of the people themselves. The written memory, the chronicle. Perhaps the greatest cultural weapon of the Anglo-Saxons was not the sword, but the pen. From the 9th century onward, scribes began compiling what would become the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year record of events, victories, defeats, and wonders. This chronicle, copied and maintained in different monasteries, gave the English something precious, a sense of shared history. Each entry, though brief, was a heartbeat of memory. In this year, the great army came to England. In this year, King Edmund was slain by the heathens. In this year, Alfred fought at Ashdown. The chronicle transformed chaos into narrative, turning disaster into a story with meaning. By writing their own past, the Anglo-Saxons forged the idea that they were one people, bound not only by blood, but by memory. Culture as resistance. In this way, religion and culture became a form of defiance. Against the Vikings who sought land and plunder, the Anglo-Saxons raised not only walls and spears, but the strength of identity. The cross on the hill, the bell in the tower, the chronicle written in their own tongue. These were symbols that said, "We endure." It was no accident that Alfred himself, later in his reign, would champion this tradition. He saw learning not as a luxury, but as a weapon of survival. To translate Latin into the English tongue was to give his people access to wisdom, to anchor them in faith, and to ensure that the past was never forgotten. In the silence of monasteries and the scratch of quills, he found allies as crucial as any fyrd bearing shield and spear. A civilization under siege. Thus, the Anglo-Saxon world was more than scattered kingdoms. It was a civilization, fragile yet profound, woven together by church and chronicle. Faith gave it endurance. Writing gave it memory. Without these, the Viking storm might have swept away not only towns and kings, but the very soul of England. And so, as the armies clashed, another battle was waged quietly in cloisters and scriptoria. The battle to remember, to preserve, to believe. It was here, in the union of sword and scripture, that Alfred would later find his deepest strength, the power not only to defend, but to define what it meant to be English. But even as Alfred drew strength from faith and learning, a darker force pressed ever closer, the relentless shadow of the Vikings. The Viking shadow. If the church was the soul of Anglo-Saxon England and the kingdoms its body, then the shadow that fell upon both was the Viking storm. From the last years of the 8th century onward, the horizon of England darkened with sails, and the roar of the northern sea carried with it a terror that reshaped the destiny of the island. Lindisfarne, the first blow, 793. It began on a windswept island off the Northumbrian coast. In 793, the holy monastery of Lindisfarne, once a beacon of learning, where monks illuminated manuscripts and sang psalms to the dawn, was struck by a force unlike any seen before. Longships surged onto the shore. Warriors with axes and spears leapt into the surf, and the sacred cloisters were defiled in fire and blood. The chronicler wrote with trembling hand, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." The raid on Lindisfarne was more than a tragedy. It was a herald. It signaled that a new enemy had entered the stage, one not bound by Christian law, nor deterred by holy places. From then on, monasteries and towns along the coast lived in perpetual dread. Each sunrise might reveal sails on the horizon. Each tide might carry doom. Waves of fire. Through the 9th century, the raids grew bolder. From Jarrow to Canterbury, from the Thames to the Severn, no shore was safe. The longship was the instrument of terror, swift, shallow-drafted, able to vanish upriver as easily as it appeared on the sea. Villages were plundered, gold and relics seized, captives dragged away in chains. To the farmer at his plow or the monk at his prayers, the Vikings seemed like storm winds, unpredictable and irresistible, yet they were not chaos alone. Behind the ferocity was skill, seamanship honed on the northern seas, discipline forged in war, and ambition that extended beyond mere plunder. The raids were the testing ground for something greater, the Great Heathen Army, 865. In 865, the storm became a hurricane. A vast coalition of warriors from Denmark and Norway crossed the sea, not in search of loot, but in pursuit of conquest. Chroniclers named it the Great Heathen Army, and its scale dwarfed all that had come before. No longer hit-and-run raiders, they came with families, leaders, and a vision of permanent settlement. Led by figures whose names carried both fear and legend, Ivar the Boneless, cunning and ruthless, Halfdan, hardened and relentless, Ubba, fierce as fire. The great army descended upon England with terrifying precision. Northumbria was the first to fall, its rival kings slain, its lands partitioned. East Anglia followed, its king Edmund struck down, his martyrdom sealing the kingdom's fate. Mercia, though proud, bent beneath the weight of invasion, forced to submit. By the late 860s, the Vikings had carved deep into the heart of England. The dream of the great army was no less than dominion over the entire island. They called their vision the Danelaw, lands ruled by Danish custom and sword, where Anglo-Saxon lords would vanish and Norse jarls would reign. The last kingdom under siege. And so, by the time Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871, the map of England had changed beyond recognition. What had been a heptarchy was reduced to a single candle flickering against the gale. The shadow of the Vikings stretched over every hill and river. To many, it seemed only a matter of time before the last kingdom fell, the English tongue silenced, the cross replaced by Odin's ravens. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle captures the starkness of the hour. Year after year, it records the march of the heathen host, the fall of towns, the burning of fields. To read it is to feel the walls of history closing in, the breath of extinction on the neck of a people. Yet within that darkness lay the seed of resistance. For shadows, however vast, are cast by light. The Viking tempest forced the Anglo-Saxons to look inward, to find unity where once there was rivalry, to imagine survival where once there was only division. And it was Alfred, standing almost alone in the wreckage, who would answer that shadow with fire of his own. To understand how that fire was kindled, we must turn back to its first spark, the birth of Alfred in the royal court of Wessex. Born in the court of Wessex, 849. In the year 849, as the Viking storm was gathering strength, a child was born in the royal court of Wessex, a child no one yet imagined would bear the weight of a kingdom's survival. His name was Alfred, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf and his queen, Osburh. A child of the last kingdom, the setting of Alfred's birth was no ordinary household, but the royal hall of Wessex, the last kingdom destined to resist the heathen tide. Great timbered halls echoed with the laughter of nobles and the clatter of feasts. Yet beneath the merriment lay unease. Every rumor from the north spoke of more ships, more raiders, more destruction. The court of Wessex was a place of both ceremony and foreboding, where the joy of birth was shadowed by the knowledge of gathering peril. Alfred was the youngest of several brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, Ethelred, each one closer to the throne than he. By tradition, the youngest son was rarely expected to rule. His destiny, it seemed, was to live in the shadow of elder brothers, perhaps to serve as a counselor, perhaps to take holy orders, but never to wear the crown. Yet fate, inexorable and merciless, was already shaping another story. The influence of Osburh. His mother Osburh left a quiet but lasting mark on Alfred's character. Chroniclers remembered her as a woman of virtue and learning. In one tale, she placed before her sons a beautifully illuminated book of poetry, declaring it would belong to the one who could first learn it by heart. It was Alfred, the youngest and least expected, who seized the challenge. The story, whether embroidered by later memory or rooted in fact, reflects the impression he left. A boy unusually drawn to knowledge, to the power of words as much as to the power of arms. In Osburh's embrace, Alfred absorbed not only a mother's love, but also a reverence for scripture and wisdom. She instilled in him what the warriors of Wessex could not, the conviction that the soul of a people rests not merely on the edge of a sword, but in the light of learning and faith. Ethelwulf and the shadow of kingship. If Osburh gave Alfred his moral compass, it was Ethelwulf, his father, who gave him the burden of lineage. Ethelwulf was a pious king, a man more comfortable with the Psalter than with politics, but also a ruler who understood the storms gathering around his realm. He had seen the raids fall upon neighboring lands. He knew Wessex was not immune. In his court, children grew up with the contrast of feasts and prayers, celebration and alarm. The atmosphere was tense with the knowledge that kingship was not security, but trial. Alfred's older brothers were trained for war, hardened in the arts of command. For the boy, it was an education in contrast, the sword on the one hand, the scripture on the other. He grew up between worlds, absorbing both. The politics of a fragile dynasty. The royal household of Wessex was no sanctuary of peace. Succession in Anglo-Saxon England was never simple, never certain. Brothers could contest brothers, nobles could shift allegiance, the church could bless or withhold its sanction. In this climate, every son of the royal line lived under the weight of uncertainty. Ethelbald, proud and ambitious, already had designs on the throne. Ethelbert was dutiful, a steady hand in turbulent times. Ethelred, younger, yet fierce, would one day prove himself in battle. Alfred the last-born watched from the margins as ambitions unfolded around him. His childhood was not sheltered innocence, but an apprenticeship in the rivalries and intrigues that haunted every royal court. A boy in a world of shadows. Thus Alfred entered life in a world already on the brink. To the north and east, kingdoms were falling beneath the Viking axe. To the south, Wessex bore the heavy expectation of being the last bulwark. Inside the palace, his brothers prepared for rule, while his father prayed for deliverance. Outside the walls, smoke rose from coasts, and rumors whispered of heathen armies. It was in this crucible that Alfred took his first steps, a boy born not to peace but to trial. He was the child no one expected to reign, yet the child destined to face the greatest storm of all. And before that storm would break, Alfred was given a glimpse of another world, a pilgrimage that carried him far from Wessex and into the heart of Christendom. The journey to Rome. From the timbered halls of Wessex to the marble streets of Rome, Alfred's childhood carried him across the map of Christendom. Still a boy, no older than 5, he embarked on a journey that would leave a mark upon his soul far deeper than any sword cut. It was a voyage from the edge of a threatened island to the heart of the Christian world, and in its course the destiny of a child began to take shape. A pilgrim prince, King Ethelwulf, Alfred's father, was a man of piety as well as power. In an age when kings often measured greatness by the sword, Ethelwulf sought legitimacy in the blessing of the church. When he resolved to make a pilgrimage to Rome, he did not go alone. With him traveled his youngest son Alfred, too young perhaps to understand the politics of kings, but old enough to feel the wonder of the road, the awe of distant lands, and the reverence of holy places. The journey itself was no small feat. Through Frankish lands they traveled, along rivers and through forests, welcomed by courts that recognized the King of Wessex as a brother in faith. For Alfred, the experience was a revelation. He saw that beyond the borders of his home lay a wider world, bound together not by tribal kingship, but by the cross. It was a first glimpse of the idea that England was not isolated, but part of something greater, a Christendom that spanned seas and empires. The Pope's blessing in Rome. The boy prince stood before Pope Leo IV, the successor of St. Peter, the most sacred authority in Western Christendom. Chroniclers tell that Alfred received a personal blessing, an anointing that marked him not merely as a child of Wessex, but as a son of the universal church. To the monks who recorded the event, it was a sign, divine favor resting on a boy otherwise destined for obscurity. For Alfred, the memory of Rome became a touchstone. The grandeur of its basilicas, the solemnity of its rites, the sense of a faith stronger than kingdoms, all these imprinted themselves upon his imagination. In later years, when the smoke of war darkened England, he would recall Rome not as distant marble, but as a vision of endurance, a symbol that faith could outlast ruin. Lessons of faith and learning. The journey also deepened Alfred's early education. Even before he could wield a sword, he was trained in prayer, scripture, and the rhythms of liturgy. Religion was not for him a mere ornament of kingship, but the foundation of his identity. Where his brothers were schooled in arms, Alfred was schooled in the book. It was in these early years that he began to grasp the union of wisdom and rule. He saw that the pen might serve the crown as surely as the spear, and that a king ignorant of learning was like a ship without a compass. This conviction would follow him all his life, driving him to revive scholarship in his kingdom, to translate sacred texts into his people's tongue, and to link the survival of England with the preservation of knowledge, the weight of memory. Though still a child, Alfred returned from Rome carrying more than blessing. He carried memory. He had walked in the footsteps of saints, seen the seat of apostolic authority, and felt the majesty of a world-spanning faith. These experiences were seeds, planted deep, which would bloom in the years of crisis to come. For when Alfred later crouched in the swamps of Athelney, hunted by Viking swords, he was not only the king of a battered Wessex. He was the boy who had stood before the Pope, who had seen the universality of Christendom, who understood that his struggle was not for Wessex alone, but for a Christian people, for a culture that bound them together, and for the survival of their very soul. A child touched by destiny. Thus the journey to Rome. seemingly a footnote in a young prince's life, became a foreshadowing of greatness. It transformed Alfred from the overlooked youngest son into a figure marked by destiny. He returned to Wessex not yet a warrior, not yet a king, but already a pilgrim, shaped by faith, formed by learning, and prepared, though he did not yet know it, for the trial that would one day define him as the Great. Yet destiny seldom follows the order of birth, and the same providence that carried Alfred to Rome would soon turn its hand upon his own family, brothers, and the path to the throne. The destiny of Alfred was never meant to be his own. In the order of things, he was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf, born far from the expectation of power, overshadowed by 3 elder brothers who each, in turn, would bear the crown of Wessex. His life seemed destined for service in the margins, an advisor perhaps, a pious scholar, a prince of no consequence. Yet history, with its merciless hand, would strip away one brother after another, until only Alfred remained. Ethelbald, the ambitious, the first to succeed, their father, was Ethelbald, bold and restless. Upon Ethelwulf's death in 858, Ethelbald seized the crown of Wessex with little hesitation. He was a man of sharp ambition, whose reign was marked less by stability than by intrigue. Chroniclers whisper of discontent among nobles, of a kingdom uneasy with his rule. Even the church raised eyebrows when Ethelbald married his stepmother Judith, the young Frankish widow of his father, an act considered scandalous, a breach of both custom and piety. But fate allowed Ethelbald little time. His reign lasted scarcely 5 years. By 860, he was gone, leaving the throne to his younger brother Ethelbert. To Alfred, watching from the sidelines, the lesson was stark. Ambition alone was fragile armor against destiny. Ethelbert the dutiful. Where Ethelbald was bold, Ethelbert was measured. Taking the throne, he brought a steadier hand to governance. He united Kent more closely with Wessex, strengthening the southern kingdom at a time when Viking sails threatened every shore. His reign was not marked by great victories, but by a sense of order, a breathing space amid gathering storms. To Alfred, Ethelbert's rule revealed another face of kingship: patience, prudence, the slow weaving of stability. Yet even the steady brother could not outlast the tide of mortality. In 865, as the great heathen army landed upon English soil, Ethelbert died. His death marked the end of a calm interlude and the beginning of the most desperate struggle in Anglo-Saxon history. Ethelred the warrior. Next came Ethelred, fierce and unyielding. Unlike his brother Ethelbert, Ethelred was tested almost immediately by war. For in the very year he mounted the throne, the great heathen army was already sweeping across England. Northumbria collapsed, East Anglia burned, Mercia reeled. Wessex, once on the fringes of danger, now stood directly in the path of annihilation. Alfred, though still young, now stood closer to power than ever before. As Ethelred's younger brother, he became the king's chief companion in arms, fighting at his side in battle after battle. It was under Ethelred's reign that Alfred first tasted the full bitterness of war. At Reading, where defeat nearly shattered their forces, and at Ashdown in 871, where victory hard won gave the English a glimpse of hope. But war spares few. In the spring of 871, as the Danes pressed their relentless assault, Ethelred fell sick and died, leaving behind sons too young to rule. Once again, destiny twisted its path. The youngest son, the boy once destined for obscurity, was now thrust forward as king. The reluctant heir, Alfred, had not been born to rule. He had not been trained, from the cradle, to expect the crown. Yet by the ruthless arithmetic of fate, Ethelbald dead, Ethelbert gone, Ethelred fallen, he was the last son standing. When the crown was placed upon his head in 871, it was not in triumph, but in crisis. The Viking storm was at its peak, Wessex battered, its people weary, and yet it was precisely this crucible that defined him. For Alfred inherited not only a kingdom on the edge of ruin, but also the lessons of his brothers. From Ethelbald, he learned the perils of unchecked ambition. From Ethelbert, the value of patience and order. From Ethelred, the courage to fight, even when defeat seemed certain. These lessons, tempered by his own resolve, would forge him into the leader that England needed, a crown of ashes and fire. Thus Alfred came to kingship not as heir apparent, but as heir of necessity. He was the son who should never have reigned, the prince written out of destiny until destiny claimed him. Behind him lay the graves of his brothers. Before him lay the fury of the great heathen army. In the spring of 871, Alfred the youngest, the scholar, the pilgrim, the reluctant heir, became king. And with that coronation, the fate of England itself shifted, for the crown he received was no ornament of peace, but a crown of ashes and fire. And yet, beneath the weight of that fiery crown, Alfred carried a treasure far rarer than gold or steel, the quiet strength of the mind, character, and learning. Long before Alfred was called the Great, before he bore sword and shield as the last hope of Wessex, there was another side to the boy who became king. In a world where valor was measured in battle and kings were judged by their victories, Alfred's deepest passion seemed strangely out of place. He loved books. He hungered for knowledge, treasured words, and looked upon learning not as a pastime, but as a light in darkness. The book before the sword chroniclers tell of Alfred's fascination with the written word, a fascination rare among princes of his time. In the tale of his mother, Osber, presenting her sons with a book adorned with bright letters and pictures, Alfred was the one who seized it eagerly. While his brothers reached for arms and armor, Alfred reached for pages. Latin, the tongue of the church and of learning, became his window into another world. Though he struggled at first, like many Anglo-Saxon nobles, he was not taught letters in early childhood. His determination was fierce. He demanded teachers, begged for instruction, and memorized passages with a zeal that astonished his elders. In Alfred's mind, books were not fragile parchment, but weapons of a different kind. They preserved wisdom, guided rulers, and spoke with a voice that could not be silenced by the clash of steel. A mind set apart. This thirst for learning marked Alfred as different. Among a people whose nobility often prized martial strength above all, he carried a contemplative spirit. He listened intently, questioned deeply, and sought to understand causes rather than merely outcomes. Where others saw only battles, Alfred saw the shape of history. Where others prayed for victory, Alfred pondered why nations rose or fell, why God granted triumph or permitted defeat. This reflective mind did not make him less of a warrior, but rather shaped him into something rarer, a ruler who thought before he struck, who sought wisdom as the foundation of action, religion, and responsibility. The faith impressed upon him during his pilgrimage to Rome deepened his conviction that kingship was more than command. It was stewardship. He saw in Scripture the duties of a shepherd, tasked not only with leading men to war, but guiding their souls toward righteousness. This sense of responsibility weighed heavily on him, yet also prepared him for trials no ordinary warrior king could endure. When others viewed disaster as divine wrath, Alfred looked for meaning, for lessons hidden within suffering. It was this union of faith and intellect that would later give him resilience in the darkest hours, when hope seemed lost and ruin certain, preparing for the unseen role. At the time, no one suspected these qualities would matter. Alfred, the youngest son, was not raised to inherit the crown. His learning was seen as personal enrichment, not statecraft. Yet history has its way of making hidden traits decisive. The very passions that set him apart, his love of books, his hunger for knowledge, his reflective spirit, would become the tools with which he rebuilt a broken kingdom. He absorbed from Latin not only scripture, but the wisdom of Rome, the laws, the philosophies that once guided empires. He recognized that strength alone could not preserve a people. Fortresses could be broken, armies defeated, but a kingdom rooted in wisdom, in justice, in the memory of its past, such a kingdom could endure. The seed of greatness. Thus, in the quiet hours of study, while his brothers bore the crown and marched to war, Alfred was being prepared in secret. The classroom of his youth was not a battlefield, but a library, not a council hall, but a cloister. Yet from these hidden lessons, he gathered strength no sword could give. So when the crown finally descended upon his brow, not by design, but by the deaths of his brothers, it did not rest upon an unprepared man. It rested upon one who had trained in silence, who had sharpened his mind as others sharpened their blades, who had come to believe that true kingship was not only the art of ruling bodies, but the art of shaping souls. The scholar king in waiting. In this way, Alfred's character and learning became his armor before he ever entered battle. He was the reluctant heir, yes, but also the scholar heir, the one who carried not only the burden of kingship, but the vision of what a king could be. His love of books, his devotion to learning, and his reflective spirit were not accidents of temperament. They were the hidden forge in which destiny prepared him. And so, when the storms of war broke over Wessex, it was not only Alfred the warrior who rose to meet them. It was Alfred the thinker, Alfred the learner, Alfred the man who had quietly prepared his whole life for a role he was never meant to play, until the hour came when only he could bear it. That hour came swiftly, heralded by the thunder of oars and the black sails of the great heathen army. The great heathen army descends. By the middle of the 9th century, the Viking threat had grown from raids into conquest. The time of fleeting attacks was over. Now came the age of armies. In 865, the horizon of England darkened as never before when a vast coalition of Norse warriors crossed the North Sea. Chroniclers called it the Great Heathen Army, and it was unlike anything the island had ever seen. The leaders of terror, at its head, marched figures whose names became legend and nightmare alike. Ivar the Boneless, son of the fearsome Ragnar Lodbrok, was said to be crippled in body, yet unmatched in cunning. His mind was as sharp as any blade, weaving strategies that baffled his enemies. With him came his brother Halfdan, a hardened warlord of relentless will, and Ubba, whose ferocity in battle was compared to fire unleashed. Together they led thousands of warriors from Denmark and Norway, men not come to plunder but to settle, to conquer, to carve out kingdoms upon English soil. The long ships that bore them lined the eastern shores like a forest of spears. From their decks spilled not only warriors, but families, wagons, and livestock. This was no passing raid. It was an invasion meant to remake the land itself. The fall of Northumbria. The storm first struck Northumbria, a kingdom already weakened by civil strife. Two rival kings, Osbert and Ella, contested the throne, their quarrel blinding them to the greater danger gathering at their gates. In 866, the great army swept upon York, the jewel of the north. The walls fell, the city was taken, and the rival kings, forced into uneasy alliance, were crushed in battle. Chroniclers tell of King Ella meeting a fate as brutal as the sagas themselves. Some accounts whisper that he was executed by the dreaded Blood Eagle, a punishment so savage that its memory clung to English hearts for generations. Whether myth or truth, the effect was the same. Northumbria's power was broken, its kings dead, its lands in the grip of pagan conquerors. The once proud kingdom of saints and scholars, home to Bede and Lindisfarne, now lay silent beneath the boots of foreign masters. East Anglia erased from the north. The great army turned eastward, its sails black against the horizon. East Anglia, smaller and poorer than Northumbria, was no match for their fury. In 869, its king, Edmund, faced the invaders. Refusing to renounce his Christian faith or bow before the heathen, he was captured and martyred, bound to a tree and pierced with arrows until his body was broken. Edmund's death became legend, and in later ages he was venerated as a saint. But in his own time, his sacrifice marked the end of his kingdom. East Anglia vanished as a sovereign realm, its fields and halls absorbed into the Danelaw. What had once been a Christian kingdom was now the province of Viking jarls. England in ruins. With Northumbria crushed and East Anglia erased, the map of England was rewritten. Only Mercia and Wessex remained as major powers, and both now faced the looming weight of the great army. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a time of despair. Each kingdom that fell seemed to prove the inevitability of conquest. The heathen host was like a flood that could not be stopped, drowning the land in fire and blood. To the people of Wessex watching from the south, the news struck. Like hammer blows, first York, then Edmund, each defeat brought the shadow closer. The last kingdom, still untouched, waited for the storm that all knew must come. A stage set for Alfred. It was in these years that Alfred, still a prince under his brother Ethelred, began to confront the reality that destiny had laid before him. The crown of Wessex was not yet his, but the burden already pressed upon his shoulders. For as the great heathen army marched ever closer, consuming kingdoms one by one, it was clear that the fate of all England would soon rest, not upon distant kings, but upon Wessex. and upon Alfred himself. And before that burden would fully descend upon Alfred, the storm swept first into Mercia, the ancient heart of Anglo-Saxon power, now trembling before the Viking host. The fall of Mercia. With Northumbria broken and East Anglia erased, the eyes of the great heathen army turned toward the center of the island, Mercia, the ancient heartland of Anglo-Saxon power. Once Mercia had been mighty. Under kings like Offa, it had commanded respect across England, building earthworks and forging alliances that stretched from the Welsh border to the Kentish coast. Its central plains and river valleys had made it a land of prosperity, a kingdom that seemed unshakable. But by the late 9th century, Mercia was a shadow of its former glory. Dynastic quarrels and weakening rulers had eroded its strength. The power that had once subdued Kent and rivaled Wessex was fractured. As the great heathen army advanced southward, Mercia stood exposed, an old giant, weary and unsteady, awaiting the fatal blow. A kingdom divided internally, Mercia was torn apart by its own divisions. Its rulers struggled to command loyalty from fractious nobles, each more concerned with local power than with the defense of the realm. When the Viking host pressed upon its borders, Mercia could not muster unity. Some lords counseled resistance, others sought compromise. Still others looked to Wessex for salvation. In such disarray, no kingdom could withstand the storm. The great army, seasoned by victories in Northumbria and East Anglia, advanced methodically into Mercian lands. Towns fell, villages burned, and fear spread along the valleys of the Trent and Severn. The mighty heart of England was bleeding out, its arteries cut by foreign steel. The humbling of Burgred. At the center of this tragedy stood King Burgred, the last Mercian ruler of significance. Faced with the sheer might of the great army, he turned not to his own resources, but to his southern ally, Wessex. In 868, Burgred appealed to King Ethelred and Prince Alfred for aid. Together, the forces of Wessex and Mercia confronted the Vikings. Yet the campaign brought little result. The invaders were too strong, too entrenched, too relentless. Within a few years, the truth was undeniable. Mercia could not stand. In 874, the great army forced Burgred into exile. Driven from his throne, he fled across the sea to Rome, where he lived out his days far from the kingdom he once ruled. His departure marked more than the fall of a king. It was the collapse of Mercian independence. A puppet throne. In Burgred's place, the Vikings installed a pliant ruler, Ceolwulf II, a king in name but a client of the Danes. His crown was no longer a symbol of Anglo-Saxon authority, but of submission. Mercia, once the proud rival of Wessex, was reduced to a fragment, its sovereignty hollowed out by foreign domination. For the Anglo-Saxons, this was a wound deeper than any battle. Mercia had been the heart of the island, the keystone of balance among the kingdoms. Its fall meant that only Wessex remained truly independent, the last beacon of resistance in a land now carved and divided. England at the brink. By the mid-800s and 70s, the map of England was scarcely recognizable. Northumbria was gone. East Anglia was gone. Mercia was humbled and half enslaved. Over these lands stretched the new order of the Danelaw, territories where Viking jarls enforced their customs and their law, where the English tongue and Christian faith were pushed to the margins. And in the south, standing alone, was Wessex. Its survival was no longer just its own concern. It was the survival of all that remained of Anglo-Saxon England. The storm had swept away every rival, every buffer, every shield. The next blow would fall upon Alfred's kingdom, and upon him would rest the fate of a people. And so the storm, having devoured every other shield, now crashed upon Wessex itself, the last wall standing between the Viking tide and the death of England. Wessex under direct threat. By the early 870s, the storm that had swept away Northumbria, erased East Anglia, and humbled Mercia, now rolled southward toward the last bastion, Wessex. For the first time, the great heathen army stood on the borders of the kingdom that had long been the final line of resistance. Behind Wessex there was no ally, no shield, only the sea. If Wessex fell, there would be no more England. Ethelred takes command. Upon the death of Mercia's king Burgred, the burden of resistance fell heavily on King Ethelred of Wessex, Alfred's elder brother. Ethelred was not blind to the peril. He knew that the full weight of the Viking horde, seasoned by years of victories, now pressed upon his borders. Yet he rose to the task, mustering the fyrd, the levy of farmers, thanes, and warriors of the shires. Bells rang in villages, summoning men to fight not only for their land, but for their very existence. Alongside Ethelred stood Alfred, no longer the boy prince of learning and prayer, but a commander in arms. Still young, not yet king, Alfred nevertheless was thrust into a position of leadership. His education in scripture and wisdom now found a harsh complement: the hard lessons of war. The Winter of Fire. The year 871 would be remembered as the Year of Battles, when Wessex bore the full brunt of the Viking fury. In rapid succession, the great army struck at Reading, their fortified camp on the Thames. The West Saxons attacked, but the battle ended in bloody defeat. Their shield wall broken, their men scattered. For a moment, it seemed that Wessex would crumble like the kingdoms before it. Yet the West Saxons did not break entirely. Ethelred and Alfred rallied their forces, gathering new men from the shires, patching the shield wall once more. They knew that if they could not hold, there would be no tomorrow for their people. The Battle of Ashdown. Then came the moment of decision. Ashdown in the rolling hills of Berkshire. The great heathen army led by the brothers Halfdan and Ubba advanced in great numbers. Their banner of the raven was raised high, its black wings spread as if to blot out the sun. Against them stood the fyrd of Wessex, weary but resolute, with Ethelred and Alfred commanding. On the morning of battle, Ethelred delayed, choosing to hear mass before leading his men. It was Alfred, the younger brother, who seized the initiative. With the Vikings pressing, Alfred ordered his division to advance. The shield wall of Wessex surged forward, spears bristling, shields locked, crashing against the enemy like a living tide. The fighting was savage. Chroniclers recall that the struggle raged across the ridge, with neither side yielding. Yet Alfred's boldness carried the day. His men struck with desperate fury, breaking through the Viking ranks, driving them down the slopes. When Ethelred at last emerged from prayer and joined the fray, the momentum was already shifting. The West Saxons, against all odds, claimed victory. A glimpse of Hope Ashdown was not a final triumph. It did not end the Viking threat, but it was a moment of hope, a spark of defiance in a landscape of ruin. For the first time, the great heathen army had been checked, their aura of invincibility broken. To the people of Wessex, it was proof that the storm could be resisted. And for Alfred, it was the moment he first showed himself not only as a scholar and prince, but as a commander of men. His courage and quick resolve turned the tide of battle when hesitation might have meant annihilation. In the crucible of Ashdown, the reluctant heir began to reveal the greatness within him. Wessex, still in peril, yet victory at Ashdown did not end the war. Battles continued through 871. Some won, many lost. Ethelred's health faltered, and the kingdom groaned under the strain of unending war. The great army still lingered, unbroken, its appetite for conquest undiminished. But something had changed. The people of Wessex had glimpsed a leader who could rally them, a prince who bore both wisdom and valor. The storm was far from over, but in its heart a figure was emerging. Alfred, who would soon carry the crown and the fate of England itself. That moment came swiftly, for as the storm raged on, the crown of Wessex passed into Alfred's hands, not by choice, but by the cruel hand of fate. Alfred ascends the throne, 871. The Winter of 871 had been written in blood. Battle after battle, Wessex had stood against the storm. Reading, Ashdown, Basing, Meerton. Some fights had ended in triumph, others in bitter defeat, but each one drained the strength of a kingdom already stretched to its limits. The great heathen army, though checked at times, remained unbroken, its ranks still swelling, its ambition undiminished. And in the midst of this crucible, tragedy struck the royal house of Wessex. The death of Ethelred king. Ethelred, weary from war and worn by illness, could no longer bear the strain. The victories and defeats of 871 had sapped his health, and while his people still looked to him, his body was failing. In the spring of that year, as the Vikings pressed ever harder, Ethelred succumbed. His death left Wessex not only bereft of a king, but vulnerable at the very hour when survival was most uncertain. For the Anglo-Saxon people, it was a moment of dread. The king was gone, the enemy was at the gates, and the land seemed poised to join Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia in ruin. Alfred crowned in crisis. Into this breach stepped Alfred, the youngest son of Ethelwulf, the scholar prince who had never been destined to rule. At perhaps 22 years of age, he was suddenly thrust upon the throne, not in triumph, but in the shadow of disaster. The coronation of Alfred in 871 was unlike the solemn ceremonies of peace. It was no procession of splendor, no feast of banners. Instead, it was marked by urgency, by the knowledge that the new king inherited not a secure crown, but a crown of fire. Around him, the fyrd was exhausted, the land weary, and the enemy stronger than ever. Yet the people looked to Alfred because there was no one else. His brothers were gone, his nephews too young, and his kingdom stood at the very edge of extinction. The mantle of leadership descended not by choice, but by necessity. A kingdom under siege. The challenges Alfred faced were staggering. Wessex was the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Every other realm had fallen or submitted to the Danes. His resources were limited. His armies were farmers called from the plow, men who fought with courage but could not remain long in the field. The enemy, by contrast, was seasoned, disciplined, and relentless. It was as if Alfred had been handed the helm of a ship already battered, its sails torn, its crew weary, while a storm raged around it. The odds were against him, yet he had no choice but to steer or sink. The weight of destiny. What marked Alfred even in these first days was his refusal to yield to despair. He had seen kingdoms fall. He knew what awaited if Wessex joined them. The memory of his journey to Rome, of the Pope's blessing, of the faith and wisdom instilled in him as a child, all these rose within him now, whispering that his people were not yet forsaken. Chroniclers later wrote that Alfred bore a character both patient and resolute, able to endure hardship without surrendering hope. In 871, this quality became his greatest strength. Even as his kingdom bled, he believed survival was possible. He would bend, retreat if he must, but never break. A crown of fire. Thus Alfred ascended the throne in the most perilous of circumstances. He was not the heir long groomed for power, but the reluctant survivor, the last son left to carry the line of Wessex. Behind him lay the graves of his brothers. Before him loomed the fury of the great heathen army. His reign began not with peace, but with peril, not with celebration, but with siege. And yet, in that crucible, Alfred began to show the qualities that would one day earn him the name the Great. The boy who loved books, the prince who had fought at Ashdown, now bore the crown of a kingdom under siege. Whether Wessex would endure or vanish like the others would depend on him alone. For years he bore that burden, holding the line with courage and cunning, until at Chippenham in the winter of 878, the storm struck with its fiercest blow. The disaster at Chippenham, 878. For 7 years after his coronation, Alfred bore the crushing weight of war. Battles were fought, truces made and broken, and the land endured wave after wave of Viking assault. Wessex remained unconquered, but it stood ever on the edge of ruin. Then, in the bitter winter of 878, the storm broke with devastating force. Guthrum's sudden strike. The Viking warlord Guthrum, cunning and relentless, had long stalked the kingdom of Wessex. Unlike raiders who struck and withdrew, Guthrum sought dominion. He had already forced Alfred into uneasy truces, only to shatter them when advantage beckoned. In January of 878, as snow and frost gripped the land, Guthrum made his boldest move. With stealth and speed, his forces swept upon Chippenham, a royal stronghold where Alfred had spent Christmas. The attack was sudden, merciless. Chroniclers say the king and his household were nearly overwhelmed in their sleep, the enemy falling upon them like wolves in the night. Villages around Chippenham were burned, the countryside ravaged, and the royal court scattered in chaos. It was the darkest moment Wessex had yet faced. A king in flight, Alfred himself barely escaped with his life. Stripped of his hall, bereft of his followers, he fled into the wilderness with only a handful of loyal companions. From king, he was reduced to fugitive. Across frozen marshes and snowbound woods he wandered, hunted, his kingdom collapsing behind him. For the people of Wessex, the disaster at Chippenham was shattering. Many submitted to Guthrum, swearing oaths to save their lives and lands. It seemed the Viking tide had at last broken the final shield wall. The king was gone, the court dissolved, and all England looked ready to fall beneath the Raven banner, the refuge of Athelney. Yet Alfred was not destroyed. Amid the marshes of Athelney in Somerset, he found refuge. Athelney was a desolate island of reeds and fens, accessible only by narrow causeways surrounded by water and mist. To some it seemed a prison. To Alfred, it became a sanctuary. Here, in the swamps, Alfred lived as an outlaw king. He built small forts, gathered what loyal men he could, and struck out in sudden raids against Viking patrols. Food was scarce, hardship constant, but in the silence of the marshes, Alfred endured. Chroniclers remembered stories of the king tending his own meager fire, even burning loaves of bread entrusted to him by a peasant woman, a humbling tale that captured the depth of his fall and the humanity of his struggle. From Athelney, Alfred plotted not only survival, but resurgence. The lowest point, the hidden fire. The winter of 878 marked the nadir of Alfred's fortunes. He was a king without a court, a ruler without a kingdom, a commander with only a few dozen men at his side. To many, it seemed his reign was over before it had truly begun. But it was precisely in this moment of defeat that Alfred's greatness was tempered. In the solitude of the marshes, he drew upon the lessons of faith, learning, and endurance that had shaped his youth. He refused to surrender, refused to accept that England was finished. Athelney became a crucible. Out of despair, Alfred forged resilience. Out of humiliation, determination. The king who had fled as a fugitive would soon emerge as the leader who rallied a nation. Thus, the story of Alfred reached its lowest ebb at Chippenham. Yet even as Wessex seemed broken, and its king reduced to hiding in the swamps, the fire of resistance still smoldered. From the reeds of Athelney, Alfred would rise again, and with him, the hope of England. And it was in this bleak exile, when Alfred seemed least a king, that legend took root, the tale of the burnt cakes. The legend of the burnt cakes. Amid the swamps of Athelney, Alfred was no longer the king in splendor, but a fugitive stripped of majesty, reduced to the barest struggle for survival. In those weeks of exile, when crown and kingdom seemed lost, there arose a tale, a story simple in form, yet immortal in memory. The burnt cakes. A humbling moment. According to the chroniclers, Alfred sought shelter in the hut of a peasant woman, unknown and unknowing of her guest's true identity. Wearied from hardship, the king accepted her kindness and was charged with a humble task, to watch the bread she baked upon the hearth. But Alfred, sunk in thought, perhaps of lost battles, of his people scattered, of the ruin of Wessex, forgot the loaves. The fire consumed them, leaving nothing but charred crusts and smoke. The woman, returning, scolded him sharply, rebuking the stranger for neglecting so small a duty. The king of Wessex, who had borne crown and sword, who had commanded armies and defied heathen lords, stood silent before the reproach of a poor woman, his dignity humbled to ashes like the bread upon the fire. More than a fable. Whether the story is fact or legend scarcely matters, for its meaning outlived the moment. The burnt cakes came to symbolize Alfred at his lowest, when the trappings of kingship were stripped away, and he was as common as the humblest of his people. It showed that even a king must endure shame, must labor and fail, as ordinary men do. Yet within this tale of failure lay also a spark of greatness, for the legend captured Alfred's resilience, a king who could endure humiliation without surrendering pride of spirit, who could rise from the ashes of his mistakes as surely as from the ashes of his ruined loaves, the symbol of a people. In later generations, the story of the burnt cakes became more than a parable of humility. It became a mirror of the English people themselves. Like their king, they had been humbled, beaten down, forced into marshes and shadows. Like him, they had tasted bitterness and shame. But like him, they would rise again. The smoke of the peasant's hearth in Athelney became, in memory, the smoke of a nation's trial, a reminder that greatness is not born of unbroken triumph, but of perseverance through humiliation. The hidden fire endures. Thus, in the legend of the burnt cakes, Alfred was remembered not merely as a fugitive or a fallen king, but as a man who shared the struggles of his people, who endured disgrace, and yet endured still. From the marshes and the scolding of a peasant woman, the story spread, binding king and commoner alike in the same narrative of suffering and survival. It was in such small human moments that Alfred's myth was forged, not only in the clash of armies, but in the quiet endurance of exile. Out of burnt bread and ashes a symbol arose, of humility, of patience, and of the hidden fire that no defeat could extinguish. And from that hidden fire, kindled in the ashes of defeat, Alfred now began to summon his people, turning despair into resolve and exile into the first spark of revival. Rallying at Somerset, the winter of despair slowly gave way to the spring of resolve. In the marshes of Athelney, Alfred had endured humiliation, hunger, and exile. Yet from those swamps arose not only a king reborn, but the stirring of a nation's will. By 878, with England's fate hanging by a thread, Alfred began to call his people once more to arms. The call of the king. At first it seemed impossible. His kingdom was scattered, its warriors weary, its villages scarred by fire. Many had bent the knee to Guthrum, swearing oaths to survive. Yet word spread through the valleys and hills. The king still lived. Alfred, the fugitive of Chippenham, the humbled man of Athelney, had not abandoned them. Slowly messengers slipped along hidden paths, carrying the summons of their king. It was not a command issued from a gilded hall, but a plea from the marshes. Rise one last time. Defend your homes, your families, your faith. Do not let England vanish. And they came. Farmers left their plows. Thanes left their halls. Shepherds left their flocks. From every corner of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, men gathered, not because they were ordered, but because they believed. They believed in their king, who had shared their suffering, who had endured their shame, who had not abandoned them in their darkest hour. The spirit of a people. What Alfred summoned was more than an army. It was a spirit. The Anglo-Saxons had been humbled, beaten, driven into swamps and shadows, but like their king, they had endured. Now, in the hour of greatest peril, their resilience hardened into unity. Chroniclers describe how Alfred's men, hardened by loss, marched not with the arrogance of conquerors, but with the grim determination of survivors. Their shield walls were no longer mere lines of warriors. They were the embodied will of a people refusing to die. This was the strength that no Viking axe could sever, not merely spears and swords, but faith and fellowship. It was the power of a nation discovering itself in adversity. The gathering at Egbert's Stone. The chosen place was Egbert's Stone, a landmark steeped in memory, named for Alfred's grandfather, King Egbert, who had once united much of England beneath his sway. There, in the shadow of the ancient stone, Alfred awaited his people, and they came, first by tens, then by hundreds, until the valleys echoed with the tramp of men. The fyrd of Wessex was reborn, not a fractured levy, but a living force, bound together by desperation and hope. As banners rose and horns sounded, it seemed that the land itself was answering Alfred's call. For the first time since the disaster at Chippenham, the tide seemed to turn. The king who had been reduced to ashes now stood at the head of an army. The fugitive of the marshes was transformed into the leader of a nation reborn. A nation awakened. The rally at Somerset was more than a military muster. It was a spiritual awakening. Alfred had endured the lowest humiliation, sharing the plight of his people, and now they shared his determination. In the stories passed down, it was said that when Alfred rode among them, men saw not just a king, but a symbol, the embodiment of their struggle, their survival, their hope. The Viking host still loomed, powerful and unyielding, yet something had changed. Wessex was no longer a kingdom waiting to be conquered. It was a people awakened, united under a king who had risen from exile. Thus, from the silence of the marshes to the echo of mustering horns, the spirit of England stirred once more. The reckoning was at hand. Guthrum and the great heathen army had not yet been defeated, but for the first time they would face a foe not broken, but reborn. At Egbert's Stone, Alfred and his people prepared to fight not merely for Wessex, but for the survival of England itself. That reckoning came swiftly, as Alfred's summons swelled into an army, and the fate of England marched with him toward Edington. The Battle of Edington, 878. The summons at Egbert's Stone had kindled a fire. From the marshes and valleys, from hidden hamlets and scarred villages, the men of Wessex had gathered. By May of 878, Alfred stood at the head of a reborn host. No longer a fugitive, he was once more a king, but a king who bore the scars of exile, whose very survival had become the symbol of his people's endurance. And now, The moment of reckoning had arrived. The march to Edington. Alfred's fyrd marched out from their mustering ground with grim resolve. Their destination was Edington, where Guthrum and the great heathen army had fortified themselves upon the high ground. The raven banner of the Danes snapped in the wind, its black wings a challenge and a threat. The West Saxons advanced through fields still scorched by war, their hearts heavy with memory of burned villages and slain kin. Yet they marched with a unity that the Vikings had not expected. At last, after months of exile and despair, Alfred's people stood as one. The clash of shield walls. On the morning of battle, the two armies faced each other across the field. Alfred's men formed their shield wall, wood and iron locking tight, a living barrier of faith and defiance. Opposite them, the Danes raised their own wall of shields, roaring with the fury of men who had conquered kingdoms. The air trembled with the sound of horns, the cry of warriors, the thundering tread as the two lines advanced. When they met, it was like storm against storm. Shields splintered, spears thrust, swords rose and fell. For hours the struggle raged, neither side yielding, the ground slick with blood. Chroniclers tell that Alfred himself fought among his men, urging them forward, steadying the line when it wavered. His voice rang out above the din, calling them not only to arms but to faith, that God had not abandoned England, that their cause was just, that their survival was ordained. The turning of the tide. At last, the wall of the Danes began to falter, the relentless pressure of Alfred's line, the grim determination of men fighting for home and faith, broke the Viking ranks. What had begun as a contest of equals turned into a rout. The Danes fled back to their camp, pursued by the victors. The camp itself was besieged. For days, Alfred's men encircled it, cutting off supplies, breaking the will of those inside. Hunger and fear gnawed at the invaders. Guthrum, once so confident of victory, found himself cornered, facing the unthinkable defeat at the hands of the last kingdom he had sworn to destroy. Guthrum's surrender. At length, Guthrum sued for peace. The terms were stark but merciful. He and his warriors would swear oaths to depart Wessex, to trouble it no more. Yet Alfred demanded more than political submission. He demanded spiritual transformation. Guthrum, the pagan warlord, agreed to be baptized into the Christian faith. In a solemn ceremony, Guthrum knelt as Alfred's godson, receiving the new name Athelstan. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was more than diplomacy. It was victory sanctified. The leader of the great heathen army had bowed not only to a king, but to the cross. A nation preserved. The Battle of Edington was more than a triumph of arms. It was the moment when England's fate hung by a thread and did not break. Wessex had withstood the storm, and in so doing, had preserved the hope of a united realm. From the marshes of Athelney to the fields of Edington, Alfred's journey had mirrored that of his people, humbled, broken, yet unyielding. His victory was not merely his own, but that of a nation reborn in adversity. The raven banner had fallen, and in its place the cross still stood. Yet a kingdom cannot endure on victory alone, and the cross that still stood at Edington now had to be safeguarded by peace as well as by war. The Treaty of Wedmore. The roar of battle faded, but the echoes of Edington resounded across all England. The raven banner had fallen, and with it, the dream of a Viking conquest of the whole island. Yet peace did not come with the sword alone. To secure the survival of Wessex and to shape the future of the land, Alfred now turned to diplomacy. Thus was forged the Treaty of Wedmore, a settlement that drew the line between destruction and endurance, between conquest and preservation. Drawing the line. In the aftermath of Guthrum's defeat and baptism, the two kings met to settle terms. The land itself would be divided. To the north and east lay the Danelaw, territories where the Vikings would rule, their customs and laws enforced by jarls and chieftains. To the south and west, Wessex and its heartlands would remain free under Alfred's crown. The line was not merely geographical, it was spiritual, cultural, and symbolic. On one side, the pagan invaders who had bent but not broken. On the other, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had refused to die. Between them stretched an invisible frontier, etched in rivers and roads, a scar across the body of England. For the first time in years, the storm relented. There was breathing space, fragile yet real. Alfred had not conquered the Danes, but neither had they conquered him. Instead, England stood divided, but alive. Alfred consolidates power. With the treaty, Alfred gained more than territory. He gained legitimacy. He was no longer the fugitive of Athelney, but the king who had preserved his people when all seemed lost. His authority, once fragile, now rested on victory and survival. The nobles of Wessex, once doubtful, now rallied to him with renewed loyalty. Alfred also understood that peace was not simply the absence of war, it was the work of rebuilding. He strengthened his defenses, reorganized his fyrd, and began constructing a network of fortified towns, burhs, that would guard against future incursions. These were not only military structures, but symbols of endurance, anchors of stability in a land long scarred by chaos. A fragile balance. The peace was uneasy. The Danelaw remained a constant threat, its warriors restless, its leaders ambitious. Yet Alfred, by securing the treaty, bought time to rebuild, to prepare, to envision a kingdom stronger than before. This balance between war and peace, between vigilance and renewal, defined the years that followed. The rivers and frontiers that marked the boundary of Wedmore were more than lines on a map. They were reminders of the precarious survival of a people, the vision of a king. What set Alfred apart was his ability to see beyond the moment. Many kings would have celebrated Edington as the final triumph. Alfred knew better. He saw that the Viking threat was not vanquished but contained, and that the true struggle lay ahead, not only to defend Wessex, but to rebuild the spirit of England itself. The Treaty of Wedmore was thus not an end, but a beginning. It marked the survival of Wessex, the preservation of Anglo-Saxon identity, and the first step toward the idea of a united England. A nation paused, not broken, so the land settled into a fragile peace. To the north and east, the Danelaw held sway, where Norse law and custom mingled with the remnants of Anglo-Saxon life. To the south and west, Alfred reigned, not over a defeated realm, but over a people who had endured, and who now looked to him as both protector and restorer. The scar of division ran deep, yet it was a scar of survival. Out of ashes, Wessex still stood. Out of despair, Alfred had carved hope. And so, with the Treaty of Wedmore, the fate of England entered a new chapter, not of conquest, but of resilience, of rebuilding, and of a king whose vision reached beyond the battlefield to the very heart of a nation's destiny. But destiny could not rest on parchment alone, for Alfred knew that treaties fade and oaths can break. Only strength, prepared and enduring, could guard the future. Military reforms. The victory at Edington and the Treaty of Wedmore gave Alfred breathing space, but he knew peace would not last forever. The Vikings were not vanquished. They lingered in the Danelaw, restless and ambitious, their longships prowling the coasts like hungry wolves. If Wessex were to survive, it could not rely on chance or divine fortune alone. Alfred understood that survival must be built, not on sand, but on stone. So began his military reforms, a transformation that turned Wessex from a kingdom always on the brink of collapse into a fortress capable of resisting any storm. The burhs, a wall of stone and people. Alfred's most enduring innovation was the creation of the burhs, fortified towns strategically placed across the kingdom. Unlike the isolated villages and monasteries that had once fallen so easily to Viking raids, these burhs were carefully planned strongholds, built on ancient Roman sites or new foundations. Each was ringed with earthen ramparts, timber palisades, and later stone walls. But the burh was not only a military installation, it was a living community. Inside its walls lived farmers, craftsmen, traders, ordinary people who, in times of peace, carried on daily life, but in times of war became the defenders of their homes. The burhs formed a network, no settlement too far from refuge, no raider able to strike without facing resistance. It was as though Alfred had woven a shield across his kingdom, each burh a link in a great chain of defense. To the Vikings, once free to ravage the countryside, Wessex now seemed an armored land. Reforming the fyrd, Alfred also recognized that the old fyrd, the levy of free men summoned for short campaigns, was no longer sufficient. Farmers could not abandon their fields for months without famine, nor could an army melt away just as danger pressed hardest. To solve this, Alfred reorganized the fyrd into a rotating system. One part of the men would serve in the field, while another stayed home to tend the land and guard the burhs. When their term ended, the groups exchanged. Thus, Wessex always had an active fighting force, while the life of the kingdom continued. This reform transformed the fyrd from a temporary levy into something close to a standing army. It gave Alfred flexibility, endurance, and the ability to respond swiftly when the Viking longships returned. The birth of the English Navy. Yet Alfred saw that the true strength of the Vikings lay not only in their armies, but in their ships. Longships gave them mobility, surprise, and dominance of the seas. To counter this, Alfred began to build something England had never possessed before: a navy. His ships were larger than the Viking vessels, designed with both sail and oar, able to fight in the open sea as well as rivers. Chroniclers claimed they were built neither on the Danish nor the Frisian pattern, but as he himself thought useful. In them lay the seed of England's future naval tradition. With his fleet, Alfred could intercept raiders before they reached shore, turning the sea from a Viking highway into a battleground where the West Saxons could hold their own. For the first time, the island began to claim mastery over the waters that had so long brought terror. The legacy of strength. These reforms, burhs, fyrd, navy, were more than military measures. They were Alfred's answer to the chaos of his age, a system that gave his people not only protection, but confidence. Where once they had cowered in fear of sudden raids, now they lived within walls of safety, under the shield of an army and the watch of a fleet. In this way, Alfred reshaped Wessex into more than a kingdom surviving by luck. He forged it into a realm prepared, resilient, and enduring. The fugitive of Athelney had become the architect of a nation's defense. And so, while the Viking threat lingered beyond the borders of the Danelaw, Wessex was no longer a land trembling at every sail on the horizon. It was a kingdom armed, armored, and ready, a fortress realm whose heart would beat on into the centuries. Yet Alfred knew that stone walls could guard the body of a kingdom, but only just laws could guard its soul. Law and governance. Alfred's kingdom was secured with walls and warriors, but he knew that no fortress of stone could endure without a fortress of justice. A kingdom might withstand the sword, but it could not survive corruption, discord, and lawlessness. To endure, Wessex needed not only shields and ships, but a framework of order that bound noble and commoner alike. Thus, Alfred turned his mind from the battlefield to the realm of law and administration. The Doom Book. Alfred's most lasting contribution was his Doom Book, a code of laws that combined the traditions of the Anglo-Saxons with the moral vision of Christianity. Drawing upon earlier codes from kings of Kent, Mercia, and his ancestor Ine of Wessex, Alfred wove them together and set them in the light of Scripture. At its beginning stood not merely royal decrees, but the 10 Commandments, the laws of Moses, and the Sermon on the Mount. It was a declaration that justice in Alfred's kingdom did not rest on his will alone, but upon a higher law, divine and eternal. The Doom Book proclaimed that the king was not above the law, but its servant, charged with ensuring that mercy and fairness guided the realm. For the people, it was a promise that their lives and property would be protected not only by the sword, but by the word. For the nobility, it was a reminder that even the mighty were bound by justice. Justice as the king's duty. Alfred strengthened the role of the king as the guardian of justice. He insisted that local lords and reeves, who often abused their authority, must govern according to the law, not whim. Chroniclers recall that Alfred himself would investigate cases, overturning unjust rulings and correcting wrongs. He declared that justice was not a privilege granted to the few, but a duty owed to all. In a land long scarred by war and pillage, this principle was radical, that even in the harshest of times, the weak had a protector in their king. Administration and order. Alongside law, Alfred improved the mechanisms of governance. He refined the shire and 100 courts, local assemblies where disputes were settled and community order preserved. He required written records, greater accountability, and the training of officials who could administer justice with consistency. In this, Alfred sought not only to command obedience, but to foster trust. His reforms ensured that Wessex was not merely a patchwork of warlords, but a kingdom bound by shared law, administered in the king's name. The spirit of governance. What gave Alfred's laws their power was not only their content, but their spirit. He believed that law must be tempered by mercy, that punishment should correct rather than simply destroy. His Doom Book echoed this principle. that justice should uphold peace, heal wounds, and reflect the Christian duty of compassion. In this vision, Alfred elevated kingship beyond warlordry. He was not only the defender of his people, but their judge, their teacher, their guardian. In an age when the sword too often ruled, Alfred proclaimed that the measure of a king lay also in wisdom and fairness, a realm of order. Thus, alongside his military defenses, Alfred built the foundations of civil order. Burhs defended the body of the kingdom, but law defended its soul. By binding tradition with faith, authority with mercy, Alfred forged a code that outlasted him, echoing in the laws of England for centuries. In the halls of justice, as on the fields of battle, Alfred the Great revealed the essence of his greatness. Not only the power to fight, but the vision to govern. He built not merely a kingdom of walls, but a kingdom of laws, an inheritance as enduring as stone and as vital as faith itself. But Alfred understood that even the strongest walls and fairest laws would crumble in time unless they were upheld by wisdom and learning. Culture and learning. Alfred had secured his kingdom with sword and shield, and he had bound it with law. Yet he knew that a nation defended by walls and justice alone would remain fragile unless it was also fortified in mind and spirit. For war could destroy cities, and law could mend disputes, but only learning and culture could give a people endurance beyond a single generation. In the quiet after Edington, when peace allowed the faint luxury of thought, Alfred turned his gaze to the realm of wisdom. He would not only be remembered as a warrior or a lawgiver, but as a king who rekindled the lamp of learning in a darkened land. The crisis of learning. The Viking wars had not only burned villages and churches, they had also scorched the very soul of learning in England. Monasteries, once the guardians of books and knowledge, lay in ruins. The treasures of Latin scholarship gathered through centuries had been scattered or lost. Fewer and fewer men could read. Fewer still could understand Latin, the language of scripture, philosophy, and law. To Alfred, this was as grave a danger as any raid. A kingdom ignorant of its past and blind to wisdom was a kingdom already weakened from within. If England were to endure, its people must once again be taught to read, to learn, to think. Translations into the tongue of the people. Thus Alfred himself took the extraordinary step of translating Latin works into Old English, the language of his people. He chose not obscure texts, but the very foundations of wisdom and morality, from the pastoral care of Pope Gregory to the consolation of philosophy by Boethius. From histories to homilies, Alfred rendered them into a tongue that every thane and priest in Wessex could understand. In his own prefaces, Alfred lamented the decay of learning, but expressed hope that through these translations, knowledge might once more flow like water into the parched soil of England. It was a revolution of the word. The treasures of Rome and Christendom no longer locked in Latin, but carried into the hearths of his people. Schools and scholars. But Alfred did not stop at translation. He founded schools, ensuring that the sons of nobles and even those of free men might be taught to read. He invited scholars from across Europe, men from Mercia, from Francia, from distant monasteries spared the Viking torch to come to Wessex. Together, they formed a circle of learning around the king, a court not only of warriors but of teachers. Through their work, books were copied, libraries rebuilt, and the fragile thread of knowledge rewoven. Wessex, once thought only as a bulwark of arms, became also a haven of letters. The vision of a scholar king. In these efforts, Alfred revealed another facet of his greatness, a belief that kingship was not merely to rule, but to enlighten. To him, ignorance was a kind of bondage, and wisdom a kind of freedom. Just as he had built burhs to guard bodies and laws to guard justice, so too did he build schools and books to guard the soul of his nation. It was said that Alfred himself delighted in study, that even amid the cares of war and rule, he would open books, learning Latin in his maturity, so that he might drink from the fountains of wisdom and pass the water to his people. A kingdom reborn in spirit. Thus the age of Alfred was not only the age of battles and treaties, but of a cultural rebirth. Where fire had destroyed, he planted seeds of learning. Where ignorance had crept, he lit lamps of wisdom, and from those lamps a light spread that would outlast his wars, outlast even his reign. In the libraries he rebuilt, in the schools he founded, in the words he translated into the tongue of his people, Alfred bequeathed not just survival, but meaning. He gave England not only a shield against enemies, but a soul against oblivion. Yet even a soul needs a body, and Alfred knew that the soul he had rekindled in Wessex must one day breathe through all the Anglo-Saxon peoples as one. The unification of the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred had defended Wessex with arms, bound it with law, and rekindled its soul with learning. Yet he knew that Wessex alone, however strong, could not forever withstand the storm. To secure the future, the scattered Anglo-Saxon peoples must be bound together, not merely as neighbors or allies, but as one. From this vision arose the idea of a single lordship, a new title that Alfred began to embody, King of the Anglo-Saxons. The birth of a title before Alfred, kingship in England, had been fractured. There were kings of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, each ruling their own realm, often in rivalry. But the Viking wars had shattered this heptarchy. Northumbria and East Anglia lay in the Danelaw. Mercia was crippled. Only Wessex remained strong. In this new world, Alfred's authority began to extend beyond his ancestral borders. Chroniclers first applied to him the title Rex Anglo-Saxonum, King of the Anglo-Saxons. It was more than a name. It was a vision. Alfred was not merely ruler of Wessex, but of all the free English who had not bowed to the Danes. He was the rallying figure of a broken nation, the axis around which unity might form. Alliance with Mercia central to this vision was Mercia, once the mighty heart of Anglo-Saxon England, now weakened but not extinguished. Its independence had faltered, but its heritage and people still carried weight. Alfred, with a statesman's foresight, bound Mercia to Wessex not through conquest, but through marriage and alliance. His daughter Ethelfled was wed to Ethelred, the lord of the Mercians. Together, they forged a bond between the two kingdoms, one political and one familial. It was a partnership that would prove decisive, for when Alfred was gone, Ethelfled would rise as the Lady of the Mercians, carrying forward his vision of unity. Thus, by diplomacy as much as by battle, Alfred wove the fabric of a single English identity, a shared destiny. The idea of King of the Anglo-Saxons was more than political convenience. It was a recognition of shared survival. Wessex and Mercia, though separate in law and custom, now faced the same enemy, shared the same faith, and looked to the same crown for hope. This identity began to spread in chronicles, charters, and prayers. To call Alfred King of the Anglo-Saxons was to declare that despite the wounds of conquest and division, the English were still one people. It was to proclaim that their destiny was not to vanish beneath the Danelaw, but to rise renewed toward a greater England. Though Alfred did not live to see a fully united kingdom, his vision sowed the seeds of what would become England. By consolidating Wessex, allying with Mercia, and embodying the kingship of all Anglo-Saxons, he laid the foundation for a realm that would, under his heirs, stretch across the island. It was a vision born of necessity, forged in war, but guided by wisdom. Alfred's reign transformed the dream of unity from a distant hope into a living reality, fragile but growing, a king beyond borders. Thus, Alfred's greatness lay not only in saving Wessex, but in redefining kingship itself. No longer a mere regional lord, he became the symbol of a people. His crown was not only of Wessex, but of all who called themselves English. In him, the scattered shards of the Anglo-Saxon world found cohesion. The title King of the Anglo-Saxons was more than honorific. It was the herald of a new age, an age where England would no longer be a cluster of rival realms, but a nation. And Alfred, standing at the crossroads of ruin and renewal, was its first architect. But no architect builds without testing, and Alfred's New England would soon be tried once more by the very storm he had fought to withstand. The new Viking onslaught, 890s. Though the Treaty of Wedmore had brought a fragile peace, Alfred never believed the Viking storm was ended. The Danelaw remained restless, and across the North Sea, new war bands still watched England with hungry eyes. The peace was a pause, not an end. And in the 890s, the storm broke again. The great invasion of the 890s, a vast fleet, set sail from the continent, carrying warriors hardened in Frankish wars and eager for plunder. Chroniclers tell of more than 200 ships landing upon English shores, disgorging thousands of raiders. It was as if the nightmare of earlier decades had returned, an echo of the great heathen army itself. But this time, England was not the same. This time, Wessex stood ready. The test of the burhs. The Viking host advanced with the same ferocity that had once brought down Northumbria in East Anglia. They struck at towns, burned fields, and sought to fracture the kingdom. Yet wherever they turned, they met walls. The burhs, the fortified towns Alfred had sown across the land, now proved their worth. No longer were villages left naked before the torch. Behind earthworks and timber, men and women held fast. Raiders found not helpless peasants, but defenders waiting, armed and organized. When the Vikings sought to press deeper, Alfred's reorganized fyrd answered swiftly. The rotating levy ensured fresh forces could respond without famine at home. The old weakness of England, armies that dispersed too soon, was gone. Time and again, the Vikings were forced back. Some sought to carve footholds, but they found themselves encircled, starved, or driven into flight. Alfred's final campaigns. Alfred himself, though older now, still rode to war. His presence gave courage. His strategy gave direction. He no longer needed to gamble on desperate field battles like Ashdown. Instead, he wielded his system of burhs and fyrds like a shield and spear, deflecting raids, then striking back at weakened foes. In these campaigns, Alfred's navy also came into play. His ships intercepted Viking longboats along rivers and coasts, cutting off supply lines and forcing the enemy into unfavorable ground. For the first time, the sea was no longer a one-sided highway of terror, but a contested frontier. Though the fighting was fierce and prolonged, the great invasion of the 800-900s ended in failure. The Vikings, unable to break the burh system, unable to starve out the fyrd, withdrew. Some slipped into the Danelaw, others retreated across the Channel. England had survived another storm. Vindication of a vision. For Alfred, these victories were more than military triumphs. They were proof that his vision, the burhs, the reformed fyrd, the navy, was not theory, but living strength. The very institutions he had built out of the ashes of Athelney now stood tested, and they held. Where once England had bent and broken, now it endured. The walls of Wessex stood not only in earth and stone, but in the hearts of its people. No longer did the sight of Viking sails bring only terror. Now it stirred defiance. The aging king. Yet even as he celebrated these triumphs, Alfred felt the weight of years. He was no longer the fugitive youth of Athelney, nor the bold prince of Ashdown. He was a king in his final decade, scarred by struggle, yet vindicated by endurance. The kingdom he had saved was stronger than ever, and his people looked upon him not only as their ruler, but as the very bulwark of their survival. The wars of the 800-900s had shown that Alfred's reign was no accident of fortune. It was the product of foresight, resilience, and vision. He had taken a land on the brink of extinction and forged it into a nation that could stand against the fiercest storm. But Alfred knew that even the strongest fortress could not endure alone. To secure England's future, Wessex needed allies, and Mercia, though weakened, was the key. Alliance with Mercia. Even as Alfred repelled the Viking storms of the 890s, his vision stretched beyond Wessex. He knew that survival could not rest upon a single kingdom alone. For England to endure, the lands of the Anglo-Saxons must be bound together. Nowhere was this more crucial than with Mercia, the once mighty heart of the island, now diminished, but not extinguished. Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians. The bond between Wessex and Mercia was sealed not by conquest, but by blood and loyalty. Alfred's daughter Ethelfled was wed to Ethelred, the Lord of the Mercians. Through her, the two realms were tied as family as well as allies. When Ethelred's health waned in the years after Alfred's campaigns, Ethelfled herself stepped into leadership. Chroniclers remember her not merely as a consort, but as a sovereign in her own right, the Lady of the Mercians. With a mind sharpened by her father's example and a spirit equal to the times, she commanded armies, fortified towns, and carried forward the same vision of defense and endurance. In her, Alfred's legacy lived, not only in Wessex, but in Mercia itself. a southern alliance under Alfred and Ethelfled. Wessex and Mercia formed a bond stronger than any seen since the days of Egbert. Their forces coordinated, their burhs interlinked, their peoples bound by common cause. Together they stood as the twin pillars of Anglo-Saxon survival. While the north and east of England lay under the shadow of the Danelaw, the south was united as never before. Alfred's title of King of the Anglo-Saxons was not empty boast. It was underpinned by the living reality of alliance, sealed in family and tested in war. This alliance was not a mere pact of convenience, but a union of destiny. Wessex and Mercia shared not only enemies but hopes. Together, they envisioned a land not forever divided by rivers and dialects, but one people bound in faith, law, and kingship. The strength of two kingdoms. The fruits of this alliance were clear. When new raids came, they found not isolated kingdoms, but a coordinated front. Alfred's burhs in the south linked with Mercian strongholds in the Midlands, forming a defensive web across the land. And where Alfred's reforming hand had reshaped Wessex, Ethelfled's leadership now renewed Mercia. She became known as a builder of towns, a patron of defense, and a commander who inspired both loyalty and fear. Chroniclers recorded her campaigns against the Danes, her victories, her unyielding will. She was her father's daughter, and her people knew it. Toward a greater unity for Alfred, the rise of Ethelfled was more than the fortune of family. It was the promise of his vision fulfilled. His dream of unity was no longer confined to Wessex. It had spread into Mercia, where his daughter bore both crown and burden. The Anglo-Saxon South, once fractured, now beat with one heart. In its unity lay the first outlines of something greater, the England that would one day rise, a king's legacy in life. Thus, in the final decade of Alfred's reign, he saw not only his own kingdom endure, but a wider alliance blossom. His daughter's hand strengthened Mercia, his laws steadied Wessex, his victories kept the Danes at bay. He was no longer merely the savior of a single kingdom. He was the architect of an alliance, the father of a dynasty, the shaper of a nation to be. And as the sun began to set on Alfred's life, it cast its glow not only on Wessex, but on all southern England, united in strength as never before. But even as his realm stood stronger than ever, the years weighed heavily upon Alfred, and the twilight of his reign began. The final years of Alfred. The last years of Alfred's life were years of hard-won peace. The storms of the 890s had subsided. The alliance with Mercia held strong. For the first time in decades, the land of the Anglo-Saxons breathed more freely. Yet though the kingdom was steadier, the king himself was aging. The weight of war, governance, and study lay heavy upon him. He had carried a crown of fire for more than 3 decades, and now the embers of his life began to glow with a different light, less fierce, but no less enduring. The toll of years. Alfred had never been a man of robust health. From his youth, he had been plagued by illness, bouts of pain that often struck without warning. Chroniclers spoke of mysterious ailments, perhaps of the stomach or bowels, that dogged him throughout his reign. Yet he had borne them in silence, masking suffering with resolve. In his final decade, those afflictions deepened. He was no longer the warrior who had charged at Ashdown, nor the fugitive who had endured the swamps of Athelney. He was a king marked by age, his body frail, but his spirit sharpened by the trials of a lifetime. A kingdom transformed. Yet while Alfred's strength waned, the kingdom he had forged grew stronger. His burhs dotted the land like a necklace of fortresses, bulwarks against raiders. His laws guided the hands of reeves and judges, binding nobles and peasants alike in a common order. His schools and translations had reopened the doors of wisdom, ensuring that learning once again flourished in England. Above all, his vision of Anglo-Saxon unity had begun to take root. Mercia stood as partner, not rival. Wessex stood as heart, not outpost. Together, they were more than survivors. They were the nucleus of a future kingdom. In these quiet years, Alfred could look upon his realm and see not just what he had defended, but what he had built. The image of a scholar king. As battle receded, Alfred turned increasingly to the life of the mind. He continued his translations, writing prefaces that spoke of his yearning for wisdom and his fear of ignorance. He gathered clerks and scholars, urging them to teach and to write, so that the mistakes of the past, The decay of learning that had left England vulnerable would not return. The warrior king of legend was in truth a scholar king, his sword as vital as his pen, his campaigns as lasting in parchment as in blood. In his court, warriors and monks stood side by side, for Alfred saw both as guardians of the kingdom. A father's legacy. In these years, he also looked to his children, who would inherit not only his crown, but his burdens. His son Edward, already proving himself in arms, stood as heir. His daughter Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, was becoming a ruler in her own right. Through them, Alfred glimpsed the future, that his work would not die with him, but live on in the hands of those he had raised and guided. The line of Wessex, once a single flickering flame in the darkness, was now a torch carried by many. The end of a king. In October of 899, Alfred the Great died. His passing was mourned not only in Wessex but in Mercia, and even in the shadowed lands of the Danelaw, where the name of Alfred had become both feared and respected. He was laid to rest first at Winchester, the heart of his kingdom, where the people gathered to honor the king who had been their defender, their judge, their teacher. His death marked the end of an age, but not of his work, for Alfred had done more than save a kingdom. He had planted the seeds of a nation. The England that would one day rise, united, literate, defended, and governed by law, was born in his vision, his labor, his suffering. A lasting light. Thus Alfred's final years shone not with the blaze of conquest, but with the glow of endurance. He left behind not empire but foundation. He had been king, warrior, lawgiver, scholar, father. To later generations he would be remembered with a single epithet, rare among rulers, the Great. And in the twilight of his reign, as the sun set upon his life, the dawn of England's future rose. That dawn was Alfred's truest gift, for though his life ended in 899, the light of his legacy only began to rise. The legacy of Alfred the Great, the year 899, closed a chapter, but it opened a memory that has never faded. Alfred, son of Ethelwulf, once a boy overlooked among greater heirs, had risen from exile and despair to carve his name into the bedrock of history. His reign had been marked by calamity and salvation, by ruin and rebuilding, by fire and faith. Yet in death, as in life, Alfred stood as more than a king. He became a symbol, a mirror in which a people could see themselves, their endurance, and their destiny. The warrior who saved a nation. Alfred's first legacy was forged in battle. When the great heathen army swept across England, kingdom after kingdom fell. Northumbria crumbled, East Anglia burned, Mercia bowed. Only Wessex remained, and even it teetered on the brink at Chippenham. It was Alfred who hunted and humbled, found strength in the swamps of Athelney, who rallied his people at Egbert's Stone, who stood firm at Edington. In that shield wall, as blood soaked the earth, England itself seemed to tremble. Had Alfred failed, there would be no England. There would be only the Danelaw from sea to sea, the raven banner flying where the cross had once stood. His victory at Edington was not merely a triumph of arms, it was the preservation of a people's future. Thus, Alfred's sword was the first pillar of his greatness. He was the warrior who saved a nation from extinction, the builder of fortresses. Yet Alfred's legacy was not of desperate victories alone. He understood that survival demanded preparation. Out of his reforms came the burhs, the chain of fortified towns that turned Wessex into a land armored against raids. His reorganization of the fyrd gave the kingdom a standing defense, a rhythm of rotation that ensured both field and fortress were manned. His fleet, the first true English navy, challenged the Vikings on the very waters that had once been their domain. These were not temporary measures. They were the architecture of a lasting defense, a system that endured beyond his reign, that his heirs would wield in their reconquest of England. In Alfred's walls and ships lay the beginnings of England as a power not only on land, but upon the seas. The lawgiver. But Alfred's greatness lay as much in parchment as in steel. With his doom book, he bound his kingdom not merely by command, but by law. In blending Anglo-Saxon custom with Christian morality, he gave England a code rooted in both tradition and faith. He declared that the king was not above the law, but servant of it, guardian of justice for high and low alike. In this vision, kingship was transformed. Alfred was not merely a warlord who won battles, but a ruler who understood that true strength lay in fairness, in order, in the trust of his people. His laws would echo through the centuries, shaping the very idea of English justice. The scholar king, perhaps most extraordinary of all, was Alfred's devotion to learning. In an age when kings were measured by conquests, Alfred was measured by books. He lamented the decay of wisdom, the loss of Latin learning, the ignorance that had left his land vulnerable. So he translated Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and others into Old English, making the treasures of thought accessible to his people. He founded schools, invited scholars, and restored monasteries as centers of study. In his court, swords and manuscripts lay side by side, for Alfred saw both as weapons in the defense of his realm. The pen was his fortress, the book his shield. Through these labors, he became the father of English prose, the first to give his people a written culture in their own tongue. In his translations, in his prefaces, one can still hear the voice of a king who longed not only for survival, but for wisdom. The father of unity. Above all, Alfred's vision of unity was his most enduring gift. He took the title King of the Anglo-Saxons, embodying not merely Wessex, but all who resisted the Danes. Through his daughter Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, and his son Edward, he extended his influence beyond the borders of his own realm. He planted the seed of an England not divided into 7 kingdoms, but gathered under one crown. Alfred did not live to see that dream fulfilled. Yet without him, there would have been no dream to fulfill. His heirs would carry forward his vision, reclaiming the Danelaw and uniting England under a single kingship. A name remembered. Alfred's contemporaries revered him. His successors honored him. And in centuries to come, his name was spoken with awe. Out of all the kings of England, only Alfred bears the epithet the Great, not for empire nor for conquest abroad, but for the salvation and foundation of his own people. He was great because he saved when all seemed lost. He was great because he built when others had only destroyed. He was great because he gave his people not only life, but purpose. The first hero of England today, more than 1,000 years after his death, Alfred still stands in bronze and stone, his figure carved upon the memory of the nation. In Winchester, his statue raises sword and cross, a reminder of the balance he held, warrior and scholar, king and servant, man and myth. He was the first hero in the history of England, not because he sought glory, but because he bore suffering. He endured exile, illness, defeat, and despair, and from them forged resilience, wisdom, and hope. The England that would give birth to Shakespeare, to Parliament, to empire, to law and liberty, all of it was born in the crucible of Alfred's reign. Epilogue. Thus ends the tale of Alfred the Great. He was a king who began as the youngest son, overlooked and unlikely. He became the fugitive of the marshes, the commander of the shield wall, the builder of burhs, the father of laws, the patron of learning, the dreamer of unity. He died not with an empire, but with a legacy. His greatness was not in what he conquered, but in what he preserved. Not in what he destroyed, but in what he built. Not in his crown, but in his vision. And so long as England endures, so too will Alfred, the king who saved a nation, the scholar who enlightened a people, the father of an idea called England.